Hello, welcome to another episode of the interview series. If you haven't seen one of these before, this is a new feature on this YouTube channel where, in addition to doing video essays, I'll be sharing some interviews that I'm doing with interesting people who are doing work in similar area to what I cover on the channel. So today I'm talking to Elliot Weir. Elliot Weir was a student journalist who infiltrated the white nationalist group Action Zealandia. Elliot, thanks for coming along.
Yeah, no, have to be on.
So what made you decide to infiltrate a white nationalist group?
Something I get asked a fair bit, but I don't have a great answer for it really. Sort of came across the website in my first year of uni, and it had been in the back of my mind for a good while. And then I started working at Critic Te Ārohi, the local student magazine, and I sort of just figured, well, why don't I send them an email and figure out what they're about. I wanted to sort of see how big they are, how much of how serious they were, how much of a threat they posed. And yeah, just kind of, I guess, attempt to try and understand some of the underlying forces that are leading to people joining something like that.
Yeah, totally. So they maintain that they're a non-violent organization and they operate within the law. I think
Mhm.
we've seen it demonstrated that's not really the case. But having had that insider view that nobody else that I'm aware of who other than a committed white nationalist has had, you could probably offer some unique insight into that. What are your thoughts on whether Action Zealandia are a non-violent group or whether they support violence or are likely to commit violence?
Yeah, it's obviously sort of can get quite complicated discourse when you're talking about whether a group is violent, because individual actors can be violent and or a group can be violent if that's like in their manifesto, and obviously it's not for Action Zealandia, and that's what they use to be like, oh, we're not violent because we don't condone violence. And when various members of their group commit acts that are sort of undeniably violent, they very lightly denounce them and say, well, they're not acting on behalf of the group, so Action Zealandia is non-violent. But
a
the sort
non-violent
of
group that has a disproportionate number of
yeah,
members who
exactly, and
outside of the group commit violence or threaten violence or
yeah, and when you're looking at what their actual goals are, their end goal, I mean, ultimately, their sort of fantasy end goal, it requires violence to get there. And while I don't think they're going to get there, and I don't think that violence that their end goal ultimately requires will necessarily happen, if that's your end goal, then can't really call yourself a non-violent group. And whenever violence was discussed in the group chats and stuff, especially with regards to the Christchurch massacre, it wasn't condoned, but not in light of it being violent, just in light of it looking bad or being ineffective to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. Whenever they would discuss someone, breaking from the group and doing something violent, it was always dismissed not as bad, not as wrong, but just as stupid or as making the group look bad. And yeah, they didn't care about the consequences, of that violence, except for what it reflected on them. And if that's the only thing stopping a group from violence, yeah, again, I don't really think you can call it a non-violent group.
Yeah, some of the comments in private chats about the Christchurch shooting were maybe what we'd expected some of these people were saying in private, but still quite shocking. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on how they talked about that atrocity and how that was discussed in these spaces?
I mean, to put it frankly, they sympathized with both the motives and the actions of the Christchurch shooter. But as I said, dismissed the actual actions because it made them look bad. It made white nationalists in general look pretty bad. And that was their view of that thing, not as being wrong, but as being detrimental to their end cause, because it did sort of spark a wave of backlash and movement against white nationalism and white supremacy.
Yeah, I don't think we'd have nearly as much attention on the far right if not for that happening. I mean, I know certainly for me, I've been involved in various kinds of left-wing progressive activism over the past 15 years, but specifically covering at the far right, was because of that. And I think even things like some of the mainstream media coverage, like some of the stuff Patrick Gower did, like the On Hate documentary, we may not have seen all that if not for Christchurch. So there's been this increased level of scrutiny on white nationalists in particular, the wider far right as well, but especially the white nationalists, because they're a pretty non-controversial group to be opposing and to be
And it does feel like within those group chats and stuff, there was a feeling of resentment towards the Christchurch shooter because of that backlash and of that basically meaning that them or any other nationalist group had to hide in the shadows. Basically, they couldn't be out in public as much as they could be before. And while I think that that's maybe changing a bit, or at least like getting a bit bolder recently, just like in general, it definitely had a profound effect on what they could get away with and what the communities around them would tolerate. So they resented it, but then again, they sympathized with both the motives and the actions.
They also discussed in these group chats infiltrating political parties, like both the small Social Credit Party, which is outside Parliament, I think gets 1,000 or 2,000 votes, and also the the National Party, the mainstream sort of centre-right party. Do you think they had any serious intentions to actually carry out this kind of infiltration, or do you think it was just fantasizing about what they could do if they were a bigger organisation?
I think there was a bit of both, really. Some members definitely were very serious about it. Other members sort of dismissed it as unattainable or not necessarily helpful to their mission. But in the leadership, it was definitely taken seriously as a goal. It was in their action plan that was sent out to members as one of the items on that list, and it did seem like it was a priority for leadership, and they did discuss having connections with those groups and making the most of those connections, but there were definitely members that did dismiss it and make jokes about it as well.
So was there kind of different levels of commitment and seriousness in the organization? It sounds a bit like the leadership were very disciplined and had, very goal orientated, whereas surely they attract a few other people who are, maybe not so disciplined about achieving these goals.
Yeah, definitely. There were plenty of people who you barely saw in the chats, and they were just there as names, but they weren't saying much. Presumably people that sympathized but weren't, sort of had lives, had other things to do, which I think is actually probably one of the best ways that we can avoid these things, is giving these people something better to do, because the leadership that were really committed, that lost their jobs for various reasons, that been disenfranchised in some ways, and they had nothing else to do other than commit themselves to this cause. So they were very serious, and they found it incredibly frustrating when other members weren't as committed or couldn't put the time in, and weren't as dedicated.
Yeah, I think
members
there's,
that were. Yeah.
I think there's probably a lot to be said about, these kind of idle young men who, maybe are spending a lot of time online or spending a lot of time reading, this far right literature and yeah, and I think if they found, hobbies other than white nationalism, it would actually, potentially make a big impact on the rise in the far right. So what kind of, we've touched on it a bit, but what kind of people are attracted to Action Zealandia? Who are the people who are joining?
Yeah, well, as I sort of hinted at, it's I mean, based on their criteria, it's white young males who presumably are straight as well. And
they have a weight limit as well. I think not only
weight.
am I too old, I'm too fat and too not racist, but
yeah. Well, I had to lie about my fitness regimen to be accepted, and it's specific criteria. And again, that was something that other members probably weren't as serious about, especially the ones that weren't meeting up with people in person as much. Pretty easy to pretend you're doing exercise when you don't have to actually see other people. But in terms of the actual types of people, other than just the demographics that they require, again, it's people that don't have anything better to do with their lives. It's people that have become disenfranchised with their communities in some way. There's a decent age range. I had quite a lot of conversations with someone who just left high school. They wanted to join the army. They got rejected from the army. So basically, and they were working on a building site, but they didn't have much else to do. They didn't have friends other than online through these groups and stuff. They didn't have pretty ostracized in their high school and stuff. And then you've got some older people as well who relatively similar stories, but just further down the line.
Do you think the organization's growing, or do you think it's reached a peak at some point?
It's an interesting question because I don't think it's necessarily either. I don't think it's currently growing, but I don't think it's necessarily peaked either. I think that, and it's hard to say, obviously, because I'm not in there anymore, and I'm not hugely aware of whether or not they hemorrhaged members afterwards or anything like that. But from what I've seen, it's relatively stagnant. But again, with the rise of anti-vax stuff that they've been sort of leaning into, as well as other various conspiratorial and far-right populism on the rise in New Zealand, it's certainly possible that some could be radicalized, like they could radicalize quite a few more people. But it's also possible that they could just kind of fade away into obscurity.
Yeah. I mean, that's the hope, I guess. I mean, there's probably a few people who are, not going to leave that world at this point. I think there's some really ideologically committed white nationalists. But, I think as a society, we can kind of cope with half a dozen white nationalists who just talk amongst themselves and don't commit violence.
And these people are the people on the fringes, can be pulled out, but it would take a lot of work and a lot of community effort to pull the people in the very deep. I think it's possible with anyone in an idealistic world, but with these people at the center of it, realistically, they're gonna be white nationalists for the rest of their life. But if Action Zealandia fades away, just like the Dominion movement before it, they might move on to another group. Plenty of Action Zealandia members, the older members, were Dominion movement members. So that's sort of what they've done. when Dominion movement faded away.
Yeah.
And it's possible that the ones in the centre of Action Zealandia will do the same.
Mm. One thing about the Dominion movement is after that group folded pretty much within an hour or two of the Christchurch shooting, you know, a lot of them, as we now know, a lot of their former members sort of reformed as Action Zealandia, but they seemed very keen to hide that connection to the Dominion movement. Was that still something you observed at the time you were infiltrating the group? Were they still trying to downplay that connection, or were
Yeah,
they more open about it and in private?
they weren't necessarily trying to hide it. The ones that came from DM, they introduced themselves as when I met them.
Oh yeah.
But when I met them as a fellow white nationalist, introduced as this member who used to be in DM back in the day. So they're certainly not hiding it amongst themselves. But they definitely are very, very keen to create something that they perceive as new, and forge something, whether or not that's from an embarrassment from the failures of the Dominion movement, or just new members being in leadership positions and wanting to make it their own in a sense. With
Yeah. Again, we've touched on a little bit, but when the pandemic started, we saw Action Zealandia start pushing some of these COVID conspiracy theories. Do you think they're actually true believers in these conspiracy theories, or is it more of an attempt to court the anti-vax movement or influence it in a more anti-Semitic direction, for example, given the other conspiracy theories that Action Zealandia were pushing?
It's an interesting one, because I think that for a lot of their beliefs, a lot of their, all of their beliefs are ultimately unreasonable, but some of the more outlandish ones, I think that sort of on a subconscious level, they know that it is outlandish. They probably know that it's wrong, but humans are very, very good at convincing ourselves of things, that beliefs that benefit us. And yeah, like shaping our worldview to fit in with what's already there. So I think that is powerful enough that they absolutely, at least some of them, have convinced themselves that these vaccines are designed by a global cabal to depopulate the white population, blah blah blah. And I think that they do believe it, but that they've convinced themselves to believe it because it does fit in with their existing worldview. And there's also, I would presume, definitely a few members that really do know that it's not, but could see it as a useful tool for recruiting more people into the far right and into their movement specifically.
Yeah, because one thing I've observed is this sort of cross-pollination of conspiracy theories. So, lots been said about the far right trying to influence, the wider anti-vax movement, particularly with like the Wellington protests where it was all intermingling together in person. But, I've also seen it go the other way. I've seen people who in 2019 never talked about vaccines, but talked about the Great Replacement, who are now also pushing, anti-vax stuff. It's going both ways, those different conspiracy theories getting shared.
Yeah, it's definitely a funnel where once you start distrusting what is considered the consensus in general, once you start rejecting your community and science and all these other things, that it's a lot easier to slip down any other of those other paths too. You talked about that cross-pollination. You've got the far right, and there you've got transphobes that used to be leftists joining far right groups and also becoming anti-vax. And they see both common interests, and there's often, I feel that some of the activists have, I guess, a pet conspiracy. Some of them might be more focused on vaccines, some of them maybe more focused on great replacement, but they'll buy into those other ones because it helps them. There's more people
makes
that
for a bigger
believe
movement,
in
you know,
general, makes for a bigger movement. And I think it is, once you believe one of them, it is really, really easy to fit those other ones into that worldview that is what far right populism is at the moment.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and that's a worrying thing about these conspiracy theories. Like I've heard it said even about the, you know, really, really mild and seemingly harmless conspiracy theories like, you know, flat Earth. But you know, I've heard it said if you can convince somebody the government is lying to them about the shape of the planet, you know, you can probably also convince them that the Holocaust is a myth, or you know, some other kind of thing there.
Yeah, and sort of every single thing on the news and that they see as happening becomes part of it. It's just adding more blocks to this alternate reality that is this shared alternate reality. And it's a lot easier if you've got one specific conspiracy theory you believe in and no one else believes in it. It's a lot harder to believe in it. But if you're buying into this collective delusion, then you've got other people that agree with you, and you've got other people that you can find community in. And that's what's really, really attractive, is that community, I feel, that they have sort of found in amongst each other, and that applies for both Action Zealandia and any other conspiracy far right kind of movement that we've got at the moment.
Yeah, and you know, and I see that in the wider kind of conspiracy theorist scene, you know, people who have, you know, lost their more traditional social networks like friends and family and co-workers, and that really is their community now, you know. And that's a worrying that's a worrying development, and you know, one that I think we're going to be dealing with for a while.
Because it's pretty hard to convince someone to leave a community. It's I think a lot harder to do that, to even convince someone that they're wrong about one specific thing.
Like it's not just about changing minds, it's about you know, leave this community that you have become part of, that you've made an integral part of your identity, you know.
Because once you've got no friends because you're racist to all of them and they've stopped being friends with you, it's really attractive to find some new friends. And if those friends believe that vaccines aren't real, then it's really beneficial for you to also believe that vaccines aren't real, because it's a lot easier to be friends with them, and vice versa, obviously. And even if you don't believe it at first, since it's beneficial to you, eventually you just do genuinely believe it. And I think that's what happened. That's what's happened with all this cross contamination.
One of the things that sets Action Zealandia apart from the wider far right is, in addition to the more explicit sort of white supremacy, which, you know, is maybe more implicit with some of the other groups, they're very openly anti-Semitic, and that actually clashes with some of the far right who are, you know, and interested in like Christian Zionist ideas, and I see these arguments go down on Telegram, and I've seen them on the New Conservative Facebook page, where suddenly the Christian Zionist sort of section of the far right will clash with the more openly, you know, anti-Semitic far right. How big a role did anti-Semitism play in the worldview of Action Zealandia?
I mean, it was pretty much the basis of it. It was the bedrock of it. But at the same time, it's also not, wasn't necessarily as common as a direct thing, but just anything that they saw a news story about a black guy robbing a store, you'd get the usual racism, but then you'd get the belief that Jews are doing this on purpose to, depopulate the white population or take over and start the New World Order and stuff. So it was sort of underlying everything, whether or not they said it. They did say it a lot of the times, though. The JQ, as it's referred to by them, was quite a common topic of discussion, almost as a litmus test. If they were talking about someone new that they wanted to recruit, it almost served as a test, as a threshold, because I think it's pretty easy to find people in New Zealand who are racist. It's pretty easy to find people in New Zealand who are transphobic. It's pretty easy to find people in New Zealand who don't want three waters, or they want, all these other things, individual things. But I think it's a lot rarer, and maybe that's just because we don't actually have that big of a Jewish population, and it's not actually that seen as much. But I think it's a lot harder to find someone in New Zealand who is explicitly anti-Semitic as one of their core ideals, and that was used as like a threshold for whether or not they were a right fit for Action Zealandia, which I found quite interesting.
That was sort of all the questions I had. Is there anything we haven't covered that you think would be important to get out there? I mean, you've obviously written extensively about Action Zealandia already, but anything that you think is important to emphasize, or an important takeaway from what you've written previously?
I think that I guess outside of what I've written already, is what's happened since then, which is mostly the emergence the emergence of far-right populism, really tied to that anti-vaccine, anti-mandate kind of push. And I think that it's been interesting to see how that as a as sort of a hook to pull people in has evolved, and now you've got anti-three waters stuff as well. So it's adapting to what is happening around us, in general, obviously. And I think to be honest, Action Zealandia is struggling to keep up. They defied to push the anti-vaccine stuff, but I think that the rise of far-right populism in New Zealand just in the past couple of years, even just in the past year, especially, with the Parliament protests and even groups like Groundswell and these other groups, and then some transphobic groups and groups that are just anti-vaccine, but they've also got some other far-right sympathies or elements. I think that has actually made it a bit harder for Action Zealandia.
I guess there's another pole of attraction there now. If you are someone that way inclined, it's not like
if you're if you have a lot of those beliefs, it's a lot easier to find a group that isn't one that's been outed as Nazis on national television and stuff. It's a lot easier to find a group that you still might lose your job for, or you still might get ostracized, but definitely a lot more socially acceptable than a small really closed group like Action Zealandia that has a lot of steps to getting in, because they've got because they're hiding their identities, because they're really secretive about and wanting to avoid random student journalists coming in and spending 6 months with them. It's a lot harder to get in. And I think that barrier for entry means that people are finding it a lot easier to just go join the Freedom and Rights Coalition, or go join any of these other groups that are a lot more out in the open at the moment. So I think that while overall that's not a great thing, I think it also hasn't been great for Action Zealandia, which I guess is a good thing.
All right. Positive note to end on. Thank you for thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me for this.
No, thanks for having me.
Thank you.